when you practice gratitude, it puts you in a state of being, a mindset, an energy that makes you receptive. And it also gives you a deep appreciation for the goodness of the universe. Hi, I'm Barb Nangle. I want to welcome you to my podcast, Fragmented to Whole Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery, where I help people heal their emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounds and make deep, lasting changes in their lives. I'm a boundaries coach who specializes in helping women who say yes when they really want to say no, and who neglect themselves because they're so focused on others. I've coached hundreds of people to create Boundaries by Design, a blueprint for life. I have a free boundary building starter kit at boundariesstarterkit.com. On this podcast, I share my experience, strength, and hope from recovery. I don't support or endorse any particular 12-step recovery fellowship, and I don't claim to speak for any 12-step fellowship. I don't believe that 12-step recovery is the only way to recover. You might need additional help. I'm an avid beachcomber and a formerly closeted fan of the Hallmark Channel, especially the Christmas movies. I wear fingerless gloves almost all year round because my hands are always cold, and I love taking pictures of license plates with my initials BN on them. My hope is that you'll find my words concretely helpful in improving your life, whether you're in recovery or not. If you like what you've heard on this episode, please screenshot it and share it on your social media. Be sure to tag me at Higher Power Coaching. This is episode 296, The Ripple Effect of Gratitude, How Small Moments Spark Big Changes. I've been keeping a nightly gratitude journal since July 23rd, 2000. I first started because I read the book Simple Abundance by Sarah Von Bronick. I will put a link to that book in the show notes in case you want to check it out. She recommended this as a practice, as a simple way to bring abundance into your life. It's one of the many practices she recommended. Her suggestion was to write 5 things every night for which you're grateful. And the reason to do 5 is to have a minimum number each day so that you have to stretch yourself to seek out things for which to be grateful. Now, in the beginning, it was actually hard for me frequently to come up with 5 things for which to be grateful, which meant that I had to stretch myself to find things for my gratitude list. This practice has really, really changed my life. In fact, doing the gratitude journal for so many years before I got into recovery really paved the way for my recovery in many ways, including the fact that I now do a nightly inventory, and it was easy to start that practice because I already had a well-established nightly journaling practice. So I could just add it on to that. And the best way to establish a new habit is to connect it to an already existing one. One of my earliest episodes was about my gratitude practice, so I'm not going to go into that in detail, but I will link that episode in the show notes. It's episode number 11. What I want to talk about on this episode is how my practice has evolved, especially recently. Once I got into recovery in 2015, I changed from putting 5 items per night on my gratitude list to putting 10 items per night because it was so easy to list 5 things that there was no effort involved because recovery just massively improved my life. Part of the benefit of doing a gratitude list comes from when you have to stretch to search for things for which to be grateful. The payoff is enormous because you seek out things for which to be grateful, which is what really shifts your perspective. You become almost wired to look for things to be grateful for, and you start to understand that there's always something for which to be grateful. When you've been digging around in your life, seeking things to be grateful for years on end, it doesn't matter how fucking shitty your life is. You can always find something good. And it's in those really, really, really shitty times that the biggest payoff happens. Well, I recently started a new morning ritual, which includes a gratitude list. I still almost always do the nightly one too, but in the morning, I have decided to go for 20 items on the list at minimum. And this helps because engaging in a gratitude practice changes our energy. It puts us in a receptive mode because we're thanking the universe. We're saying, I love all these things on my list and I want more of them. What a great way to start the day. Since I started this morning practice, I have found myself being more and more grateful for people and incidents in my life that have been pivotal in changing the trajectory of my life. These are things that typically we can't see until well after the fact. So I'm just going to share a couple of examples, but I'll go into kind of a lot of detail about both of them. I'm doing that because sharing these serves as a reminder that the universe is wise. The universe is for me, not against me. The universe is for you and not against you too. So here is story number 1. I am really grateful for a car accident I had in 1998. I was driving a Geo Metro. If you're not familiar with that car, it was a 3-cylinder car. I used to tell people it's a matchbox car. At the time, it was probably the smallest car you could own. And I got into an accident that was somebody else's fault, and the car was rolled over. And the only thing that happened to me, miraculously, was that I got a scratch on my neck because of the seatbelt. When that accident happened, I had never been so fucking angry in my entire life. I was a broke graduate student. My car was paid off, and I was hoping to drive it for another couple of years so I wouldn't have a car payment. And now that was over because it was totaled and I had to get another car. I was angry about the financial impact. I was angry about the inconvenience of having to do all the work to report to the insurance company and get a new car. I was angry about the fact that the driver whose fault it was only got a ticket and no other repercussions because he was driving a vehicle that was part of the landscape crew for the University of Connecticut. And the truck was fine. And then it wasn't his personal property. All he got was a ticket. Whereas I had tons of repercussions in terms of my time and money and energy. There was more that I was angry about, but I won't go into that now. As a result of this accident, the finance guy in the place where I got my next car told me about the book Conversations with God. Well, I just happened to have a gift certificate for the Borders bookstore at home. I'd gotten it about 3 weeks prior for my birthday, and it was a miracle that I hadn't spent it yet because I was the kind of person back then who spent gift certificates immediately. So I went and got the book with the gift certificate and read the book over the weekend. And when I went to work on Monday, I'd been transformed from being a lifelong agnostic to becoming a believer in my own conception of God. A few months later, I found out about a job in New Haven and I interviewed for it and I ended up getting it. And I would never have considered taking the job if I was driving a 7-year-old Geo Metro over an hour each way to New Haven. It just wouldn't have been something I would have considered. I probably wouldn't have even interviewed for it. I didn't realize until a couple years later the trajectory that this car accident put me on. Not only did I take the job at Yale, a couple years later, I ended up moving to New Haven. And if you had ever told me that I would be a city person one day, I would never have believed you. I grew up in rural and suburban Connecticut, and I live in New Haven to this day, and I absolutely love New Haven. So the entire trajectory of my life changed because of that car accident. I went from being a lifelong agnostic to being a believer in my own conception of God. I went from being a rural and suburban person to being a city person. I got connected to so many people, places, and things and opportunities, both through my job at Yale, through volunteering, and then also the communities I got connected to. I got into recovery in this community, and I started my business and got it connected to entrepreneurs in this community. So when I'm writing these gratitude lists, I'm doing things like thanking the guy for totaling my car, thanking the guy in the finance office for telling me about the book Conversations with God, thanking my brother and then sister-in-law for giving me a gift certificate to Borders Books for my birthday, which was like 3 weeks before the accident happened, thanking myself for not spending that gift certificate right away, which was probably the first time ever and was highly unusual for me. Thanking my fellow student at UConn who got me into the resume writing and interview skills workshop, which landed me the job at Yale. Now, the list goes on and on. So that is one example of how a bunch of things tied together and how you can see in retrospect that something I was super angry about and thought was an absolute disaster led to so many fantastic things and changed the entire trajectory of my life. The second story I want to talk about is all of the people, places, and things that needed to be in place for me to meet and fall in love with my sweetheart, Chuck. Now, that wouldn't happen if I didn't live in New Haven. So thank you, car accident. I met my sweetheart initially when our two churches were potentially going to merge. Now, our churches were in the same denomination, but that denomination was formed back in 1961 when a whole bunch of different denominations merged together to form the United Church of Christ. If that had not happened back in 1961, he and I wouldn't have met because we wouldn't have been in the same denomination. Now, the church he went to happened to be the same one I went to for 12-step recovery meetings. That will be relevant to the story in a moment. Now, our two churches were potentially going to merge because a lot of churches are shrinking. So that societal process of churches shrinking needed to happen for us to meet. We met the first time during a community meeting for members of our two churches to talk about this potential merger. And he and I happened to go to the same meeting. So thank you to him for showing up and thank you to me for showing up. But also thank you to Tony, the guy who facilitated the meeting. Tony will come back up in a moment. Another thing that happened after that initial meeting is that I saw Chuck outside of a 12-step meeting a few weeks later, and I noted in my mind, oh, he's in 12-step recovery too. Now, when our two churches voted not to merge, I left my church because I wasn't happy with the way that we handled the process. His church, where my 12-step meetings were, decided to close. So they told the 12-step groups that we each had a year to find a new location. Later, when I saw Tony, the guy who facilitated the meeting I met Chuck at, I said, hey, that was such a nice gesture on the part of your church to offer us an entire year to find a new meeting place. And he was like, yeah, that's because of Chuck. He was largely responsible for keeping the 12-step groups in the forefronts of the minds of the congregation when we were making decisions. And in my mind, I thought, well, of course he did, because he's a 12-stepper. Now, fast forward several months, I was on a road trip out west, and I walked in a labyrinth in Sedona. And when I did, Chuck popped in my mind, and my first thought was, oh, I guess this must mean I'm supposed to express my gratitude to him for keeping the 12-step groups in the forefronts of the minds of the congregation so they would give us a whole year to find a new place to meet. So thank you, gratitude practice, for conditioning me to think in terms of gratitude. And thank you, Tony, for saying what you said about Chuck keeping the 12-step groups in mind when the congregation decided to fold. Now, when he popped into my mind in this labyrinth in Sedona, I didn't know his last name or his contact info, but I knew we had a mutual acquaintance. And I texted that guy, his name is David, and said, "Hey, David, can you pass on this message of gratitude to Chuck?" And he said, "Sure, I can, but here's his number in case you want to reach out to him directly," which I did. So thank you, David, for passing on his number instead of just saying, "I'll pass on your message." Now, I could go on about the many, many other things I'm grateful for that led me to be with my sweetheart, Chuck. The idea is to look at all the things that had to happen for this relationship to occur. So, what this new gratitude practice is doing for me is reminding me that the briefest sentence could change the trajectory of your life. You may not know it for years to come. So, if Tony hadn't mentioned Chuck's role in giving a year's time to 12 step groups, who knows if he would have popped into my mind in the labyrinth. But if he had, I certainly wouldn't have thought to reach out to him to express gratitude to him. So when you practice gratitude, it puts you in a state of being, a mindset, an energy that makes you receptive. And it also gives you a deep appreciation for the goodness of the universe. So if you're feeling particularly down, I highly recommend you start a gratitude practice. It doesn't have to be daily. It could be an on-the-spot thing when you're in a down mood. But if you really want the long-term perspective-changing experience I'm talking about, developing a daily habit will do the trick. What I found is that professional women are afraid people won't like them, so they don't say no. Then they become overwhelmed and resentful because they keep giving in to others and take on too much. What they really want is to have balanced relationships where there's give and take without having to have a confrontation. But they think the problem is that if they knew just the right words to say, things would go more smoothly and they'd be able to stick to their boundaries. So they end up letting people walk all over them and then explode when they can't take it anymore. But the real problem is that they don't know what's okay with them and not okay with them because they're so focused on others. That means they don't set limits or ask for help. What they need to do is focus internally to get clear on what matters to them so they know what to say no to and can communicate that clearly with calm confidence. If this sounds like you, we should talk. Go to barbchat.net to sign up for a call with me. If you like this podcast, and I'm guessing you did because you're still listening, you will also love my weekly newsletter, Friday Fragments, which has short essays similar to the podcast. You can check it out at fridayfragments.news. That's fridayfragments.news. If you haven't already subscribed to my podcast on your favorite podcast outlet, please do that. It helps carry the message to more people. I started this podcast because there was so much wisdom in recovery that just wasn't making its way out into the world. So I want as many people as possible to hear it. I'd also love it if you'd leave a 5-star rating or a review, which you can do on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find it so they can get the benefits that you've gotten from listening. If someone in particular came to mind when you listen to this episode, please share it with them. And my favorite place to hang out on social media is Instagram. I'm at Higher Power Coaching. Please DM me there. I'd love to hear what you got from this episode. I run private and group coaching programs on building healthy boundaries. Whether you need help with boundaries in your personal, professional, or romantic life, I can help. Head on over to barbchat.net where you can get on my calendar for a free 30-minute Better Boundaries consultation. I also do short-term situational coaching to help people make it through specific situations they're going through, such as divorce, empty nesting, preparing for retirement, or any phase where their identity is shifting. Regardless of the type of coaching, my ideal client is someone who is ripe for change. If that's you, I'd love to work with you. My goal with all my work is to help you make lasting changes in your life, like I've made deep, lasting changes in my life. Remember, it's never too late to recover. No one is beyond hope, and healing is possible. Thanks for listening.